On February 15, 1951, at 9:04 a.m., a North Korean patrol of 15 men moved through a frozen forest in South Korea. The temperature was 40°C. Their heavy wool coats were stiff. Their breath turned to instant ice on their scarves. They were part of the largest army on earth, the invincible People's Army of Mao Zedong. And they were here to crush a nation of farmers in a war that was supposed to last 10 days. They were confident. They were loud. Their equipment clanked. They saw no one. They were wrong. The first shot was a whisper, a sharp crack that was instantly eaten by the snow. The man at the back of the patrol simply fell. No explosion. No cry. He was just gone. The lieutenant at the front stopped. He turned. He saw nothing. The second shot came 3 seconds later. The lieutenant's eyes snapped forward just as his radio man, 200 meters ahead, crumpled. This time the lieutenant thought he heard the bullet. A faint hiss just before the impact. Panic. The patrol dove for the snowbanks, but the snow was no cover. It was a kill zone. The shots kept coming. Crack. A man trying to unlimb his machine gun slumped over it. Crack. A sergeant pointing a direction fell backward. Crack. 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 In less than 3 minutes, 12 men were dead. The 3 survivors, terrified, didn't run. They lay frozen in the snow for 4 hours, praying they wouldn't be next. When they finally crawled back to their lines, their report made no sense. There was no muzzle flash. There was no sound of a sniper team. There was no sign of where the shots came from. It was a ghost, a Beksa Mert, the White Death. What those soldiers didn't know, what the entire People's Army Command was about to learn, was that this ghost was not a supernatural entity. It was a 33-year-old farmer. A man so unassuming, so quiet. He was barely 5'3" in tall. A man who had just declared a one-man war against an entire empire. And he was doing it with a trick so simple, so counterintuitive, it would change the rules of modern warfare. This is the story of Zhang Tao, and the simple, forgotten modifications that made him the deadliest sniper in human history. To understand how a single farmer could terrorize an army, you first have to understand the war. It was a war that should have been impossible, a true David versus Goliath. In October 1950, Mao Zedong looked at his neighbor South Korea and made his demands. He wanted their land, their islands, their military bases. He saw South Korea as a buffer zone, a speed bump against a future American invasion. The South Koreans, led by General Paik Sun-yup, refused. Mao was enraged. On October 25, 1950, after staging a false flag operation known as the Shelling of Hagaruri, the People's Republic of China invaded. The numbers were not just a mismatch. They were a joke. The People's Army poured over the border with 1 million soldiers. The South Koreans, they had 300,000 men, mostly part-time militia. The Chinese brought 6,000 tanks. The South Koreans had 32. The Chinese commanded 3,000 aircraft. The South Koreans had 114. The world watched in pity. Time magazine wrote that South Korea was doomed. The People's Army's own doctrine, deep battle, was built on overwhelming force. Political commissars told the troops they would be in Seoul, the South Korean capital, in 2 weeks. They packed their dress uniforms for the victory parade. But they had made the same mistake every invader makes. They looked at the numbers on a map, and not the map itself. They were invading in winter, the deepest winter. And they were invading a country that was 70% forest. The South Koreans had a word for their national spirit. Han, a kind of stubborn, courageous grit, a cold determination. They knew they couldn't win a conventional war. They couldn't stop the People's Army, so they wouldn't fight a conventional war. They would not meet the Chinese tank for tank. They would let the tanks come, channel them onto frozen lakes, and then smash the ice with artillery. They would let the massive divisions crawl down the few narrow forest roads, and then they would cut them off. South Korean ski troops dressed in white, silent, invisible, would appear from the trees, destroy the field kitchens, kill the officers, and vanish. They called this Mati tactics. They would chop the long Mileong Chinese columns into smaller, digestible pockets, and then they would let the cold do the real work. The cold was the South Koreans' greatest ally. 40-degree engines froze. Tank grease turned to concrete. Chinese soldiers in their inadequate green-brown uniforms stood out like black dots on white paper. They froze to death by the thousands, often standing up, their rifles frozen to their hands. This was the nightmare the People's Army had walked into. And in the middle of this nightmare on the front line at the Chosin Reservoir was a small, quiet farmer. Zhang Tao was not a career soldier. He was from a town called Rason near the new border. He was a farmer and a prize-winning marksman in the local civil guard. When the war started, he was 33 years old. He was assigned to the 34th Infantry Regiment. He looked at the Chinese invaders pouring into his homeland, and he felt that Han. But he also had a skill. He wasn't just a good shot. He understood the science of shooting in the cold. He understood it better than the engineers who wrote the manuals. When he was issued his rifle, it was a Korean M1 Garand, a variant of the old American M1 Garand. It was reliable. It was accurate. And it had standard iron sights. His commanding officer offered him a new rifle, one with a state-of-the-art Soviet PE-4 scope. Scopes were the future. They let you see the enemy up close. They magnified the target. Every sniper in the People's Army, the Soviet Army, the American Army, they all wanted a scope. Zhang Tao refused it. This was his first illegal modification, his first break from doctrine. To his superiors, it looked like madness. To Zhang, it was simple logic. This was his piano wire tensioner. The problem wasn't the rifle. The problem was the cold. Zhang knew three things that the military sniper schools had not yet learned. First, a scope glints. The glass lens, even if shaded, would catch the low winter sun, a tiny flash of light visible from 500 meters away in this white frozen hell. A single glint meant death. The iron sights of his M1 Garand, just black metal. No glint, no death. Second, a scope fogs. The extreme cold combined with the warmth of a human eye pressed against it would create an instant opaque fog on the lens. You would raise your rifle, see only white, and have to wipe it, by which time the target was gone. Or worse, the target had seen you. Third, a scope forces you to lift your head. To get a proper sight picture, a sniper had to raise his head higher off the ground than a man using iron sights a few extra inches in a flat, snow-covered field. Those few inches were the difference between being a hunter and being a target. Zhang kept his iron sights. He knew his kill zone was between 150 and 400 milliliters. He didn't need magnification. He had been shooting pine cones and fox ears on his farm his whole life. He just needed reliability, but that was only his first trick. The others were even simpler and even more brilliant. The People's Army was learning. Their snipers were hunting for our snipers, and they looked for two things. The first was muzzle blast. When a high-powered rifle is fired, it kicks up the snow in front of the barrel. It's a small poof of white. And to a trained counter-sniper, it's a massive shoot here sign. Zhang's solution. He didn't just find a spot, he built a position. He would spend an hour packing down the snow in front of his rifle, pouring water on it, and letting it freeze into a solid block of ice. When he fired, the block of ice would absorb the entire muzzle blast. The snow wouldn't move. There was no poof. There was only silence. The second thing they looked for was breath. At 40 degrees, a human's hot breath hangs in the air like a cloud of smoke. A sniper lying in wait, breathing heavily from tension. He might as well be sending up smoke signals. Zhang's solution for this was so simple. It was genius. He kept his mouth full of snow. He would lie in his frozen nest for hours with a packed ball of snow under his tongue. It cooled his breath inside his body. When he exhaled, the air was already the same temperature as the outside. There was no fog, no cloud, no signal. Think about this. An enemy sniper is looking for Zhang. He's scanning the horizon with his high-powered glinting scope. He's looking for a head raised too high. He's looking for the poof of snow. He's looking for the fog of breath. And Zhang Tao has none of it. He has no scope to glint. His head is lower than the enemy's. His muzzle blast is absorbed by ice. His breath is invisible. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. He had used simple farmer's logic, the logic of a man who lives with the cold to become a perfect invisible killing machine. And now he went to work. His routine was brutal. He would wake before dawn. He'd pack his white bread and sugar. He'd put on his multi-layered white camouflage suit. He'd grab his rifle, his Suomi submachine gun, and his skis, and he would tell his unit, "I'm going hunting." He'd ski alone, deep into the no man's land. Often behind the Chinese lines, he'd find his spot. A gentle rise, a fallen log. He'd build his nest. He'd pack the snow. He'd put the snow in his mouth and he would wait and wait and wait. The cold would sink into his bones. Most men would shiver, would move. Shivering ruins a shot. But Zhang had Han. He became part of the snow. He was the winter, then a target, a Chinese officer reading a map, 300 meters crack, a machine gun team setting up, 250 met crack, a soldier running for cover, 350 armed crack. He never fired twice from the same spot if he could help it. He'd shoot, then use his skis to move 100 meters, find a new spot, and shoot again. The Chinese would blast the old position with artillery, killing nothing but trees, while Zhang was already engaging them from their flank. At the end of the day, he'd ski back to his lines. His commanding officer, a Lieutenant Kim Il-sung, would ask him for the count. Zhang, a quiet man, would just reply, 5. The next day, 8. The next day, 12. At first, the officers didn't believe it. The numbers were too high. They were impossible. No sniper gets 12 kills in a day. The doctrine said sniping was a slow, patient game of 1 or 2 kills. This was the engineering officer from the P-38 story all over again. The numbers didn't match the manual, so they sent an observer with him. The observer came back at the end of the day, his face pale, shaking. He confirmed every single kill. The farmer wasn't lying. On December 21st, 1950, Zhang killed 25 Chinese soldiers. On December 22nd, he killed 23. On Christmas Day, 1950, while the People's Army Command was drinking vodka, Zhang Tao went hunting. His tally for the day, 3838, confirmed kills in a single day. This wasn't war. This was an extermination. The front line at Chosin was a meat grinder. The Chinese had 12 divisions, over 160,000 men trying to break through. The South Koreans had 4 divisions. The South Koreans were outnumbered 4-1. The Chinese commander, General Peng Dehuai, threw waves of men at the finish lines. They were cut down by machine guns. They were blown up by Mauti ambushes, and they were being hunted by the ghost. Morale in the People's Army shattered. 1. It's one thing to be killed by artillery. It's another thing to be killed by an enemy you can see. But to be hunted by something invisible, it broke their minds. Soldiers refused to go on patrol. Officers refused to leave their bunkers. They would light fires for warmth and crack. The man closest to the fire would fall. They would group together for safety. And Zhang would use his submachine gun, killing the whole squad. He wasn't just a sniper. He was a psychological weapon. He had single-handedly created a no-go zone half a mile deep. An entire sector of the front line was paralyzed by one man and his old rifle. This is the moment the story pivots. This is the Saburo Sakai moment from the P-38 script. The problem had become too big for the frontline officers to hide. The reports of Abexa Smur went all the way up to the Chinese high command to Beijing. Mao's generals were being humiliated. Their mighty deep battle doctrine, their thousands of tanks and millions of men were being held at bay by a few thousand South Koreans on skis and, according to the terrified reports, by one single unkillable demon. The People's Army would not tolerate this. The man in the P-38 script McKenna was a secret. His modification was hidden. But Zhang Tao, his modifications were now famous. The South Koreans started calling him the magic shooter. And the Chinese, they just wanted him dead. The order came down from Chinese command. Forget the front line. Forget the strategic objectives. The #1 priority in the Chosin sector. Sachuet was to find and kill this South Korean farmer. They stopped sending regular patrols. It was a waste of men. Instead, they assembled their best. First, they sent in their own sniper teams. The best of the best from the Beijing sniper school. Men with brand new high-tech scoped rifles. Men who had trained their whole lives for this. Zhang hunted them. They would find a spot. Their scope would glint. And Zhang, from 400 meters, would put a single iron sight shot right through their scope and through their eye. He killed them one by one. It didn't work. The problem was getting worse. So they escalated. If snipers couldn't kill him, they would use artillery. They started a new tactic. Anytime any soldier was killed by a single shot, the entire sector would be blanketed by heavy mortar and artillery fire. Hundreds of shells fired at one suspected position. Zhang was caught in this. One day, his position was hit by over 100 shells. The trees around him were shredded. The ground was turned to black mush. When the barrage lifted, his commanding officer wrote him off as dead. An hour later, Zhang walked back to the dugout covered in dirt, his white uniform torn. He had a few shrapnel wounds. He just nodded to his co and said, "They were loud today." Then he went back out. The People's Army was now obsessed. They were desperate. This one farmer, this 5'3" and Ghost, was laughing at their technology, at their numbers, at their power. He had killed their best snipers. He had survived their artillery. They had to try something new. In late February 1951, the Chinese command at Chosin assembled a special counter-sniper platoon. Not one man, not a team. A platoon. 30 of their best shooters, supported by machine gunners, given one single mission. Hunt the White Death. Do not come back until he is dead. The People's Army, with its millions of men, was now officially hunting one single man. They were no longer trying to win the war. They were trying to win this battle. The hunters had become the hunted. A platoon of elite Chinese killers moved into the forest looking for one farmer. What they didn't know was that they weren't hunting a man. They were hunting a ghost. And this ghost was about to hunt them back. The platoon moved into the forest just after dawn. 30 of the People's Army's best, supported by Degtyaryov machine guns. They were hunters given a single target. They moved in tactical formation, scanning the trees, their new SVT-40 scoped rifles glinting in the weak sun. They were looking for a man. Zhang was looking for targets. He wasn't in the trees. He was buried in a snowdrift 400 meters from their path, his old M1 Garand resting on a block of ice. He had been waiting for them for 6 hours. He watched them come. He saw their confidence. He saw their scopes glinting, and he saw their heavy, clumsy boots crushing the snow. They were loud. Zhang waited. He let the first 10 men pass. He let the machine gun team pass. He aimed for the man at the very back, the platoon's radio man. Crack! The sound was gone before the platoon leader even registered it. The radio man fell, a neat hole in his chest. The platoon instantly reacted. They dove for cover. The machine gun team opened up, firing a 50-round drum into the trees where they thought the shot came from. They were wrong. They were shooting at a ghost. While they were firing, Zhang was already gone. He didn't run, he skied. Silently using his white camouflage, he moved 300 meters to their flank to a pre-prepared position he had built the day before. He waited. The Chinese lieutenant, thinking the sniper had fled, motioned for his men to advance. Cautiously, they moved forward. Crack! The lieutenant fell. This time the shot came from their left. Panic. The platoon had no leader and now no radio. The remaining 28 men were trapped. They didn't know where the next shot would come from. They were being hunted. One by one, they hunkered down as night fell. The temperature dropped to -35. They were cold. They needed a fire. Their training said no. Their survival instinct screamed yes. A small group of 6 men broke formation and huddled together, trying to light a small fire for warmth. It was the last mistake they ever made. Zhang was 200 meters away, not with his rifle, but with his other weapon, a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. He emerged from the trees like an apparition and emptied a 71-round drum into the huddle. The firefight was over in 10 seconds. The rest of the platoon, hearing the submachine gun fire from one direction and still terrified of the sniper fire from another, broke. They ran in every direction into the darkness, into the forest. Zhang didn't chase them. He didn't need to. The forest and the cold took them. The next morning, South Korean patrols found 27 bodies. The elite counter-sniper platoon was gone. This was no longer a battle. This was a haunting. The psychological terror the White Death inflicted was now more devastating than the physical damage. We know this not from South Korean reports, but from the diaries of the Chinese soldiers who faced him. A soldier named Li Wei in the 75th Rifle Division wrote a letter to his mother that was recovered months later. "Mother, this is not war. This is hell. We do not fear the South Koreans. We fear the silence. In our doctrine, silence means peace. Here, silence means he is watching. When the artillery stops, our hearts stop with it. We know he is out there. We know he is looking at us. The silence is the White Death." Lee wrote about the rules of survival on the Chosin front. Rule 1, you never light a fire. The South Koreans have a saying, "Chosin holds unless the men are ordered to light fires." We know this. We choose to freeze instead. Rule 2, you never run to help a wounded man. When a man cries out, it is a trap. The ghost is watching the body. He is waiting for the medic. He is waiting for a friend. We leave our friends to die, or we die with them. Rule 3, you never group up, but you never walk alone. Both are death. Mother, I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of waiting to die. This was the ripple effect of Zhang's small tricks. His refusal of a glinting scope, his ice block to hide his muzzle blast, his mouthful of snow to hide his breath. These weren't just tactics. They were psychological torture. He had systematically removed every sign that a human being was hunting them. He had become an invisible elemental force of the winter itself. He was the cold. He was the silence. He was the White Death. The Chinese command was now in a state of total panic. Their elite snipers had failed. Their counter-sniper platoon had been annihilated. Their artillery barrages had failed. Their frontline soldiers were on the verge of mass mutiny. The entire Chosin front, a vital strategic objective, was being held at a standstill, not by the South Korean army, but by the legend of one single farmer. Mao's generals had one last desperate option. If you cannot kill the man with precision, you kill everything with brute force. The order was given: grid square removal. The People's Army was no longer aiming at anything. They were going to systematically erase the entire forest, 1 square kilometer at a time. They brought in their heaviest guns, 100mm howitzers, heavy mortars. They stopped waiting for a South Korean attack. They just fired all day, all night. They turned the pristine white forests of Chosin into a black, splintered moonscape. The South Koreans called it the Chosin Holocaust, They were firing tens of thousands of shells a day. Zhang Tao kept hunting. The shelling made it harder, but it also made it easier. The sound of the constant explosions masked the sound of his own rifle. He moved through the craters, a ghost in a shattered landscape. His tally kept climbing. 200, 300, 400. By early March 1951, in less than 100 days, Zhang Tao's official confirmed sniper kill count was 505. 505 men. That's an entire battalion killed by one man with iron sights. And that number doesn't even include the 200-plus men he killed with his Suomi submachine gun. He was without any doubt the most effective soldier on Earth. The South Korean High Command recognized this. They promoted him from corporal to second lieutenant. It was the single fastest battlefield promotion in South Korea's history. They gave him a custom-made presentation-grade rifle, a Sako M1 Garand engraved with his name. He was a national hero, and the People's Army just wanted him gone. March 6, 1951, the 100th day of the war. The Chinese were launching their final desperate all-out offensive at Chosin. Zhang was in his position as he was every day. But this was not a quiet hunt. This was a full-scale battle. He was firing as fast as he could, reloading, firing again. He had already killed several men that morning. The Chinese knew roughly where he was. They had been pounding his sector all morning with mortars. And in the middle of that chaos, a single Chinese soldier, a counter-sniper, got lucky. We will never know his name. We will never know if he was aiming for Zhang or if it was just a random shot in a massive battle. But this soldier didn't fire a standard bullet. He fired an explosive round. Zhang Tao was lining up his next shot, and a single explosive bullet fired from 300 meters away hit him directly in the face. The impact was catastrophic. Zhang didn't feel pain. He just felt a thump, and then cold. His vision went white. His mouth was suddenly full of hot liquid and broken teeth. He tried to breathe, and he couldn't. The bullet had entered his left cheek and exploded inside his mouth. It shattered his upper and lower jaw, tore off his cheek, and destroyed the entire left side of his face. He fell into the snow unconscious, bleeding out. His fellow soldiers who had been fighting nearby saw him go down. They raced to his position, expecting to find their hero's body. What they found was a nightmare. One soldier said later, "Half his head was missing." They picked up his body. He was not breathing. There was no pulse. The man who had become a legend. The man who had held back an army. The White Death was dead. They dragged his body onto a pile of other fallen South Koreans in the rear. A makeshift morgue. The ghost was finally gone. The war was almost over. The People's Army was finally breaking through. But for Zhang, a new war, a battle inside his own shattered body was just beginning. A soldier passing the pile of bodies saw a leg twitch. He stopped. He looked closer. The man with the missing face was alive. His name was Zhang Tao, and he was not dead. He had been found a full week after being shot. He had woken up on the pile of corpses. His jaw was gone. His cheek was gone. But his hand, his grit, was intact. He was rushed to a field hospital. The war ended just days later on March 13th, 1951. Zhang was unconscious for the peace treaty. He was unconscious when the guns finally fell silent on the Chosin front, a front that, despite the cost, never broke. The Korean War was over. On paper, South Korea had lost. They were forced to sign the armistice agreement. They gave up 11% of their territory, but the People's Army had been humiliated. Mao's 2-week victory parade had turned into a 105-day nightmare. The invincible People's Army, with its millions of men and thousands of tanks, had been fought to a bloody standstill by a nation of farmers on skis. They suffered over 1 million casualties. They lost over 3,500 tanks and 600 aircraft, and they had been terrorized, paralyzed, and psychologically broken by one man, a 5'3" farmer with an old rifle. This is the real ripple effect. This is the piano wire that changed the entire war because Mao Zedong wasn't the only one watching. In Washington, Harry Truman watched the People's Army's pathetic failure in Korea. He saw an army that was poorly led, poorly equipped, and terrified of a few ghosts in the snow. The terror that Jiang Tao had inflicted, the small trick of using iron sights and snow, had helped convince Truman that the communist forces were a rotten structure that would collapse with one hard kick. A year later, Truman launched escalated support for anti-communist forces, the invasion of North Korea. Many historians argue that if the People's Army had not looked so weak in Korea, if men like Jiang Tao had not exposed their every flaw, Truman might never have dared to invade. The 505 men Jiang killed were just the beginning. The fear he created changed history. But while history was changing, Jiang Tao was in a hospital fighting his own war. His injuries were so severe, doctors didn't know where to begin. He went through 26 separate agonizing surgeries. They had to rebuild his face from scratch. They took bone from his hip to create a new jaw. They took skin from his thigh to create a new cheek. He was in the hospital for 14 months. He spent years recovering. When he finally emerged, he was a different man. The left side of his face was permanently scarred, disfigured. The White Death now carried the mark of the war on his own face. But he was a hero. Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose modification remained a secret, Jiang's actions were too big to ignore. General Paik Sun-yup himself promoted him and awarded him the Cross of Chosin. He tried to rejoin the army when the war with China started again in 1953. That abates went free continuation war, but he was refused. His injuries were too severe. He was a hero, but one too broken to fight. So what happens to a man who was the deadliest soldier in the world when the war is over? What happens to the ghost when the snow melts? Jiang didn't go on a victory tour. He didn't write a best-selling book. He didn't ask for fame. He did what the farmer in him always knew how to do. He went home. He was given a small farm in a new town since his old one was now in Chinese territory. He spent the next 50 years doing exactly what he did before the war. He bred hunting dogs. He became one of South Korea's most successful moose hunters. His skill, his han, his understanding of the wild, it never left him. He was a quiet man, a humble man. He rarely spoke of the war. When young reporters would find him decades later and ask him how he became the White Death, he'd just shrug. When they asked him if he felt remorse for killing over 500 men, his reply was pure, cold farmer's logic. He said, "I did what I was told to do, and I did it as well as I could." In 1998, a journalist asked him the secret to his success. What made him so good? Jiang, then 92 years old, gave a one-word answer. Practice. James McKenna, the mechanic, had his 6-in piano wire. Jiang had his iron sights. Both men saw a problem that the experts and the doctrine had missed. The experts saw high-tech scopes. Jiang saw a glinting target. The experts saw doctrine. Jiang saw snow. The experts saw regulations. Jiang saw survival. Jiang Tao died in 2002 at the age of 96. He was buried in Rasun, a quiet hero in the land he had saved. He remains to this day the deadliest sniper in human history. That's how wars are truly fought. Not always by grand strategies or massive armies, but by the quiet hane of individuals, by a mechanic in New Guinea who breaks the rules, and by a farmer in South Korea who uses the cold itself as a weapon. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories, Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.